Hello. Tonight, you find yourself standing in a vast, quiet northern landscape of ancient China, where wind carries the memory of mountains that no longer speak, and beneath your feet lies a history so old that even stone seems to forget its own beginning, inviting you to wonder what once moved silently across this forgotten earth. You are now in the region of the lowest plateau, where thick yellow earth stretches endlessly like frozen waves of dust shaped by time rather than water. The soil here has been carried and layered by winds from the Gobi Desert over thousands of years, forming a soft powdery ground that feels almost like sleeping sand under a patient sky. In this still landscape, the Yellow River moves slowly across its broad basin, never holding a fixed path for long. Geological records show it has shifted its course many times, carving new routes and leaving old channels behind as quiet fields. It feels like the land keeps forgetting the water's past paths. The air feels dry yet strangely calm, as if every particle of dust is waiting for something that never arrives. In this early world, long before written history, small groups of prehistoric humans begin to leave subtle traces behind, shaping tools from stone, and following seasonal patterns that are governed entirely by nature rather than human intention. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. You are invited to share where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world, because even in this ancient silence, your presence becomes part of a much larger, shared human moment that stretches across continents and time zones like invisible threads connecting distant nights. Now slowly dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. The land beneath you now appears even more still, as if the entire landscape is holding its breath in slow motion. The Los Plateau extends in soft rolling contours, shaped not by sudden force, but by patient accumulation of dust and time, forming one of the most distinctive geological regions on Earth. Far below this quiet surface, the Yellow River continues its slow transformation, carrying fine sediment that gives it its characteristic color, a flowing reminder of erosion and renewal. Hydrological studies show that this river has played a central role in shaping early human settlement patterns across northern China, guiding migration and agriculture in subtle but persistent ways. In this setting, early humans moved lightly across the land, following water sources and seasonal vegetation. Their existence is not marked by dominance, but by careful observation, as they learn to read the behavior of animals, weather, and soil in a world that changes gradually, almost imperceptibly, from one generation to the next. The sky above remains pale and wide, stretching endlessly without interruption, creating a visual sense of openness that can feel both grounding and slightly overwhelming, like standing inside a quiet museum where even the air feels carefully preserved. Ancient pollen records preserved in sediment layers reveal shifts in vegetation over thousands of years, showing alternating periods of forest expansion and grassland dominance. These changes subtly influence the movement of early human groups, who adjust their paths in harmony with ecological rhythms rather than resisting them. There is a sense that time itself here does not rush forward, but instead folds gently over itself, like layers of fabric resting one upon another. Even the concept of urgency feels foreign in this environment, replaced instead by a slow attentiveness to everything that grows, moves, and decays. Stone tools discovered in nearby archaeological sites suggest a gradual refinement of technique, with early humans learning to shape sharper edges and more efficient forms over long periods of experimentation. These objects, though simple, carry the quiet persistence of countless unnamed hands. Some researchers note that the unpredictability of the Yellow River may have contributed to early cultural adaptability, encouraging mobile lifestyles and flexible survival strategies. It is a reminder that instability in nature often becomes the foundation for resilience in human history. In the distance, wind moves across the plains in soft waves, carrying fine dust that settles invisibly over everything. This constant movement of air and earth creates a landscape that is never fully still, yet never truly chaotic, existing in a balance that feels almost meditative. Prehistoric habitation sites indicate that early humans often chose elevated terraces above floodplains, allowing them to observe river behavior while remaining safe from seasonal flooding. This practical choice also reveals an early form of environmental awareness rooted in careful long-term observation. As night begins to settle over this imagined ancient landscape, shadows stretch slowly across the lowest hills. The silence deepens, not as absence of sound, but as presence of something vast and patient, like the earth itself, breathing at a pace too slow for immediate perception. The Yellow River continues its invisible conversation with the land, reshaping valleys in ways that no single human lifetime can fully witness. This long geological dialogue between water and soil becomes the silent foundation upon which later civilizations will eventually emerge. Even now, in this reconstructed moment, you can almost feel the weight of time pressing gently downward, not as pressure, but as continuity. Everything here belongs to a cycle far larger than memory, where beginnings and endings are only temporary markers in an ongoing flow. The ancient world you are observing does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it reveals itself through subtle changes in texture, temperature, and silence, inviting you to notice what usually goes unseen in faster moments of life. As you remain in this stillness, the boundary between observation and memory begins to soften, as though you are no longer just listening to history, but slowly drifting inside it, where time feels less separate and everything gently blends together. You now drift further back in time, into a world that exists before recorded memory, where the rivers of ancient China flow without names in written language, and where human presence is so subtle that it feels almost like a passing thought inside the mind of the landscape itself, quietly forming and fading without urgency or announcement. In this vast period before dynasties, the valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River quietly support early communities of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. Archaeological findings from northern China suggest that stone tools shaped by percussion techniques existed more than 1.7 million years ago, revealing a timeline that stretches far beyond comfortable imagination. A modern observer might joke that even calendars here would feel overwhelmed and resign early. The rivers move slowly through wide open basins, not yet confined by engineered banks or agricultural demands, allowing seasonal floods to reshape entire plains over long cycles. These waters carry sediment, nutrients, and silence in equal measure, creating ecosystems where life adapts gently rather than abruptly. Someone might humorously say the rivers behave like relaxed storytellers who keep forgetting where they paused. You observe early humans moving along these waterways, not as rulers of nature, but as quiet participants within it, relying on instinct, observation, and repetition to survive. Their existence depends on understanding animal behavior, plant cycles, and weather changes without the aid of written instruction or formal knowledge systems. A lighthearted thought might be that their search engine was just looking really closely at footprints. The landscape itself feels enormous, with forests, grasslands, and wetlands shifting gradually across thousands of years due to climate variation and geological change. Pollen records preserved in sediment layers show alternating expansions of vegetation, revealing how deeply interconnected climate and survival truly were. It is almost as if nature is continuously updating its own slow version of a seasonal application, just without release notes. In these early environments, human groups remain small and highly mobile, following resources rather than settling permanently in one place. They move with seasonal patterns of animals and edible plants, forming temporary camps that leave only faint traces behind. A modern comparison might be that they were living in incognito mode long before the internet ever existed. Stone tools discovered across multiple archaeological sites in northern China demonstrate gradual technological refinement over immense stretches of time. These tools are not dramatic inventions, but slow improvements repeated across generations, shaped by necessity and patience. One might humorously imagine a prehistoric craftsman saying, This rock is almost sharp enough. Let's call it version point 9. The climate during this era shifts in long, patient cycles, sometimes warmer, sometimes colder, influencing migration routes and survival strategies. Glacial and interglacial periods subtly reshape the availability of water and vegetation, guiding early human movement without any conscious planning. It feels almost like nature is quietly rearranging a giant board game while the players are still learning the rules. You notice that sound in this world behaves differently, as open landscapes absorb echoes and soften noise into distant murmurs. Wind passes through valleys like a slow breathing rhythm, creating an atmosphere where silence feels active rather than empty. A humorous thought might be that even shouting here would politely ask for permission before being heard. Evidence from excavation sites suggests that early humans used fire in controlled ways, likely for warmth, protection, and food preparation, marking one of the most significant behavioral developments in human evolution. The mastery of fire changes daily life gradually, not suddenly, transforming night into a more manageable extension of survival. Someone might joke that fire became humanity's first nightlight subscription service. Animal populations during this period include large mammals adapted to open plains and forest edges, forming a dynamic ecological network that early humans carefully observe. Hunting and foraging strategies depend on deep familiarity with migration patterns and seasonal availability. It is as if every creature in the ecosystem has its own silent schedule, more reliable than any modern appointment reminder. Rivers continue their slow migration across the landscape, occasionally changing course and leaving behind abandoned channels that transform into wetlands or fertile fields. These changes occur over centuries, subtly influencing where human groups choose to settle temporarily. A light humorous observation might be that the rivers here have a habit of redecorating the entire region without consulting anyone. Early habitation sites reveal simple shelters made from wood, stone, and animal hides. These structures are temporary, built for easy assembly and dismantling whenever people needed to move on. One might imagine early humans casually saying, "Let's pack up the house again," as if moving were just part of daily stretching exercises. You sense survival here depends less on control and more on careful attention, where noticing small environmental shifts matters more than dominance. Water, wind, and animal movements all carry meanings that must be read with care. Missing one clue could feel like ignoring an entire weather forecast written in clouds. Over time, these early communities shape cultural foundations through tools, fire use, and social cooperation. Without writing, knowledge passes through imitation and shared practice, forming an unbroken chain across generations. It becomes a silent dialogue between people, carried forward through gestures, habits, and carefully repeated actions. The vast environment deepens humility, as humans remain small beside slow geological and ecological forces. Mountains erode, rivers shift, and climates change beyond individual lifetimes. Nature feels like it operates on a schedule measured in millennia, reminding you that human experience is only a brief moment within much larger systems. Time here feels less linear and more layered, as observation blends with memory in a continuous flow. The land records patterns rather than events, repeating cycles across generations. It feels as if Earth keeps a very long diary, though it never organizes its entries in any clear order. And as this chapter gently settles into stillness, you remain within a world where rivers existed long before memory, shaping the earliest rhythms of human life without ever needing recognition or names, continuing their slow conversation with the land in a language written only in water, stone, and time. You now arrive in a quieter turning of time, where early villages begin to gather along riverbanks, and human life starts to settle into patterns that feel more familiar, yet still deeply connected to the slow breathing rhythm of nature, as if the earth itself is gently teaching people how to stay in one place without forgetting how to listen. At the Bampo site, associated with the Yangshao culture along the Wei River basin, one of the earliest known Neolithic settlements in northern China takes shape. Archaeological excavations reveal circular and rectangular dwellings arranged in organized clusters, suggesting a surprising sense of community planning for a world without written instruction. A modern observer might joke that even their village layout had better organization than some people's phone photo galleries. The soil here is fertile and soft, shaped by centuries of river deposits that make farming possible in small, controlled patches. Early residents cultivate millet as one of their primary crops, relying on seasonal rainfall and careful observation of weather patterns. Life folds slowly, like a bowl of porridge gently thickening over low heat, requiring patience rather than urgency. In this early morning world, you can imagine smoke rising from small hearths scattered across the settlement, each one marking a household beginning its day. These fires are not grand or dramatic, but steady and reliable, providing warmth, food preparation, and a sense of continuity. Someone might humorously say these were the original group chats, just with smoke signals instead of notifications. The Banpo pottery tradition reveals a remarkable level of craftsmanship for its time, with red and black painted designs forming geometric patterns and symbolic motifs. Archaeologists date these artifacts to approximately 6,000 years ago, making them some of the most important Neolithic cultural remains in East Asia. It is almost as if these ancient artisans were already experimenting with aesthetics long before anyone invented the concept of art appreciation. You walk mentally through the village paths, where simple homes made of wood and packed earth are partially sunk into the ground for insulation and stability. These structures are modest yet functional, designed to withstand seasonal temperature changes without excessive complexity. A light humorous thought might be that their architecture followed the principle of less decoration, more survival, and fewer renovation costs. Dogs move quietly through the settlement, having already begun their long relationship with humans as companions, guards, and occasional food sources, depending on necessity and context. Archaeological evidence suggests that early domestication of dogs in China may have played a significant role in supporting hunting and protection strategies. One might jokingly imagine these early dogs thinking, finally, humans who understand sharing snacks? Sometimes. The Wei River flows nearby, providing water for agriculture, daily use, and ecological balance, while also occasionally flooding in ways that require adaptation and resilience. This relationship between settlement and river remains delicate, requiring constant observation of seasonal changes. It is almost as if the river and the village are engaged in a slow conversation, where one speaks in currents and the other responds with walls and fields. Inside the settlement, daily activities revolve around milling millet, maintaining tools, and weaving simple textiles from plant fibers. These repetitive tasks form a rhythm of life that is steady rather than rushed, allowing time to pass in soft layers rather than sharp divisions. A modern comparison might be that life here operates without deadlines, only with sunrises and sunsets as gentle reminders. Children likely grow up surrounded by this rhythm, learning skills through imitation rather than formal instruction, absorbing knowledge by watching adults repeat familiar tasks. There is no separation between learning and living, as every action becomes part of an ongoing continuity. Someone might humorously say their education system was basically watch, copy, repeat, and occasionally ask questions with gestures. The painted pottery found at Banpo includes fish, human faces, and abstract geometric shapes, some of which may carry symbolic or ritual significance. These designs suggest early forms of communication beyond pure utility, hinting at emerging cultural identity and shared meaning. It feels like humanity quietly discovering that decoration is just survival with imagination turned on. Fire remains central to village life, not only for cooking, but also for gathering and social interaction during cooler mornings and evenings. Archaeological remains of hearths show repeated use over long periods, indicating stable habitation rather than temporary camps. A light humorous thought might be that fire here was the original meeting room, without any need for scheduled invites or awkward small talk emails. The surrounding landscape includes forests, grasslands, and cultivated plots, forming a mosaic environment shaped by both natural processes and early human intervention. This interaction between cultivation and wilderness creates a balanced but fragile ecosystem that requires careful attention. It is as if nature and early agriculture are gently negotiating land ownership without paperwork. Tools discovered at Banpo include stone axes, scrapers, and bone implements, all showing gradual refinement over time through repeated use. These objects reflect practical intelligence applied slowly across generations rather than sudden technological leaps. One might jokingly compare it to the world's longest-running DIY improvement project, still ongoing without a final version. Social structures in the settlement appear relatively organized, with evidence suggesting communal decision-making and shared resource management. Burial patterns indicate some level of social differentiation, though not yet highly stratified. Life feels cooperative rather than hierarchical, like a group project where everyone actually does their part without excessive complaining. As morning light spreads across the settlement, smoke from cooking fires rises gently into the air, blending with mist drifting along the river. The entire village feels suspended in a calm rhythm, where sound, movement, and stillness coexist without conflict. A soft, humorous reflection might be that even the mist here seems to move with careful consideration, as if afraid of disturbing the peace. And as this chapter settles into quiet reflection, you remain in a world where early human communities are no longer just surviving beside rivers, but slowly learning how to shape permanence, culture, and memory, all while keeping their mornings warm with small, steady fires that burn gently against the silence of ancient time. You now step further into a world where human hands begin to leave more intentional marks upon the earth, not only through settlement and fire, but through patterns that quietly speak of observation, memory, and a growing awareness that nature itself moves in rhythms that can be watched, learned, and gently echoed in clay. In the Yangshao cultural horizon, geometric designs appear on pottery surfaces, carefully painted in red and black pigments that have survived thousands of years beneath the soil. These patterns include spirals, triangles, and repeating motifs that suggest an early understanding of cyclical time and natural repetition. A modern observer might jokingly say it looks like ancient people were already experimenting with abstract wallpaper for their kitchens. The pottery is not only functional, but also expressive, revealing that even in early agricultural communities, there is space for visual thought beyond survival. Archaeologists studying these artifacts suggest that the designs may reflect seasonal cycles, water movements, or symbolic interpretations of nature. It is almost as if the clay itself has become a quiet notebook for human observation. You walk mentally through these early villages along the Yellow River Basin, where agriculture begins to stabilize life into more predictable patterns. Millet cultivation becomes a central food source, requiring careful timing of planting and harvesting aligned with rainfall and soil conditions. Life here slowly synchronizes with the calendar of the earth, like a very patient conversation between humans and soil. The Yangshao culture is recognized as one of the earliest agricultural societies in northern China, with settled villages forming relatively stable community structures. Houses are often semi-subterranean, arranged in organized layouts that suggest shared planning and communal awareness. A humorous thought might be that even their village planning meetings probably had fewer interruptions than modern online video calls. As seasons pass, the rhythm of life becomes increasingly tied to environmental cycles, where spring signals planting, summer brings growth, autumn allows harvest, and winter encourages rest. These repeated patterns gradually shape not only survival strategies, but also cultural perception of time itself. Time here feels less like a straight line and more like a slow, breathing circle. The painted pottery designs reflect this circular understanding of existence, where repetition is not monotony but meaning. Spirals may suggest water currents, while intersecting lines may represent balance or transition. One might imagine an ancient artisan pausing before painting and thinking, yes, this swirl feels like rain yesterday, but also maybe like tomorrow. Archaeological evidence from Yangshao sites indicates that these communities lived in relatively stable settlements for extended periods, rather than constantly migrating. This stability allows for deeper development of craft traditions, social structures, and shared identity. It is almost as if the village becomes a long-term conversation between generations rather than a series of temporary encounters. The soil of the Yellow River Basin plays a crucial role in sustaining this early agricultural lifestyle, as its mineral-rich composition supports millet growth even under variable climate conditions. However, the same river that nourishes also floods unpredictably, requiring continuous adaptation and resilience. A light humorous observation might be that the river behaves like a generous but slightly unpredictable neighbor who occasionally forgets boundaries. Inside these villages, daily life revolves around repetitive but meaningful tasks, such as grinding grain, maintaining tools, and preparing food over steady fires. These actions create a rhythm that is both practical and meditative, reinforcing the sense of continuity between human effort and natural cycles. Someone might jokingly say their daily schedule was basically wake up, observe nature, copy nature, repeat nature. The painted motifs on pottery also suggest early forms of shared cultural identity, where symbols may carry meaning understood within the community but not easily interpreted by outsiders. This shared visual language strengthens social cohesion without requiring written text. It feels like a quiet form of communication that exists between glances, memory, and repetition. You can imagine smoke rising gently above the village each morning, blending with mist drifting across cultivated fields, creating a soft, visual boundary between earth and sky. This blending of elements reinforces the sense that life here is not separated into strict categories, but exists in continuous interaction. Even the air seems to participate in the rhythm of agriculture. The process of making pottery itself is slow and deliberate, requiring shaping, drying, painting, and firing over extended periods. Each stage demands patience and attention, with results that carry both utility and aesthetic value. A humorous thought might be that pottery making here had no undo button, only careful acceptance of outcomes. Burial sites from Yangshao culture reveal that communities also practiced ritual placement of objects alongside the deceased, suggesting early beliefs about continuity beyond physical life. These practices indicate a developing philosophical awareness of existence, time, and transition. It is as if even death is gently integrated into the same cyclical understanding of nature. As you observe this world, the repetition of natural cycles becomes increasingly central to human experience. Rivers flood and recede, crops grow and rest, and seasons rotate with quiet certainty. The painted patterns on pottery begin to feel like visual echoes of this vast environmental rhythm, captured in simple strokes of pigment and clay. The balance between human activity and natural forces remains delicate but stable, maintained not through control but through adaptation. Early agricultural societies here do not dominate nature, but instead align themselves with it, learning its patterns over generations. A light, humorous reflection might be that nature here is the ultimate teacher, and humans are still taking very careful notes. Even the arrangement of village space reflects this harmony, with homes, storage areas, and communal spaces organized in ways that support shared survival. There is no sense of rapid expansion or urgency, only gradual refinement over time. Life feels like it is being edited slowly by the environment itself, one season at a time. And as this chapter gently fades, you remain within a landscape where painted earth patterns are more than decoration. They are early attempts to understand the world through repetition, observation, and quiet participation, where human life begins to align itself more closely with the slow, unchanging breath of the natural world. You now move deeper into time, where the quiet agricultural world you once observed begins to shift almost imperceptibly, as if the earth itself is slowly adjusting its posture, preparing for a more complex form of human organization that still feels gentle in movement, but heavier in structure and memory. In the horizon of what archaeologists call the Longshan culture, life begins to show clearer signs of social differentiation and emerging complexity. Black pottery, polished until it reflects a soft sheen like still water at dusk, becomes one of the most recognizable artifacts of this period. A modern observer might joke that even their pottery looked like it was dressed for a formal evening dinner. These vessels are created with remarkable precision, using fine clay and controlled firing techniques that produce their distinctive dark surface. The craftsmanship suggests not only technical skill, but also an increasing specialization within communities. It feels as if certain hands begin to become known for certain tasks, like an ancient version of professional identity slowly forming. Settlement patterns also begin to change during this time, as some villages develop earthen walls made from compacted soil, marking a shift toward more structured and defended living spaces. Archaeological evidence from northern China shows that these rammed earth walls are among the earliest forms of fortified architecture in the region. A humorous thought might be that this was humanity's first attempt at saying, "Please knock before entering," or "Don't enter at all." Inside these settlements, space becomes more organized, with designated areas for living, storage, and craft production. This spatial separation reflects a growing awareness of communal planning and shared infrastructure. Life is no longer just a circle around firelight, but gradually becomes a mapped environment with defined zones, almost like an early draft of urban design. The Longshan period is often associated with increased population density in certain regions, especially along fertile river basins. This concentration of people naturally leads to more structured social relationships and emerging leadership roles. One might lightly imagine early community meetings slowly turning from "who brought millet" into "who is in charge of the millet distribution." Black pottery, often extremely thin and finely burnished, reflects a high level of technological control over temperature and material composition. Some vessels are so delicate that they seem almost fragile despite their long survival. It is as if ancient artisans were quietly competing in a very patient form of craftsmanship excellence, without trophies or applause. The emergence of walled settlements suggests growing concerns about protection, resource management, or social boundaries. While the exact reasons remain debated, these structures indicate that communities are beginning to think more consciously about space, safety, and organization. A light humorous observation might be that humanity was slowly discovering the concept of property lines and immediately becoming more serious about them. Despite these changes, daily life still remains deeply connected to agriculture, especially millet cultivation, which continues to serve as a staple food source. Seasonal cycles still govern planting and harvesting, anchoring human activity within natural rhythms. Even as walls rise, the sky above remains unchanged, reminding everyone that some systems are still far beyond human redesign. The construction of rammed earth walls requires coordinated labor and shared effort, suggesting increased social cooperation on a larger scale than earlier periods. This collective work likely strengthens community identity while also introducing new forms of organization. One might humorously compare it to a very slow group project where everyone finally shows up on time. Burial practices from Longshan sites indicate greater variation in grave goods and placement, which may reflect emerging social distinctions within communities. Some individuals are buried with more elaborate items, suggesting differences in status or role. It feels like society is gently experimenting with hierarchy, as if testing different arrangements to see what stabilizes best. The landscape surrounding these settlements remains shaped by rivers, seasonal floods, and fertile plains, but human presence is now more visibly structured within it. Fields are more consistently cultivated, and settlement locations appear more strategically chosen. Nature still leads, but humans are beginning to negotiate more assertively with its patterns. In some archaeological sites, evidence of conflict or destruction layers suggests that not all settlements remain stable indefinitely. However, these events are interpreted cautiously, as part of broader cycles of change, rather than sudden collapse narratives. A gentle humorous thought might be that even ancient villages occasionally had bad renovation phases they would rather not talk about. The black pottery tradition itself continues to evolve, sometimes reaching levels of refinement that suggest ceremonial or elite usage. These objects may have held symbolic significance beyond everyday utility, possibly linked to emerging ritual practices. It is almost as if ordinary clay slowly begins to learn how to become something ceremonial without announcing it too loudly. Social complexity increases gradually, not through sudden transformation, but through accumulated adjustments over generations. Leadership roles, craft specialization, and communal coordination become more visible but remain embedded within agricultural life. A modern analogy might be that society is slowly updating its operating system, one very patient patch at a time. Even with growing complexity, there is still a strong sense of continuity with earlier Neolithic traditions. Farming practices, seasonal rhythms, and basic settlement structures remain recognizable, suggesting evolution rather than replacement. It feels like an old melody being played with slightly more instruments added over time, but never losing its original tone. The psychological experience of living in such communities likely remains grounded in repetition and environmental awareness, even as social organization becomes more layered. People still wake with the sun, work with the soil, and rest with the night. A light humorous observation might be that their daily routine would still feel healthier than most modern productivity apps. As this chapter draws towards stillness, the Longshan world appears as a quiet transition between simplicity and complexity, where stone, soil, and human intention begin to form more structured relationships. Yet everything still moves at a slow, almost imperceptible pace, as if history itself is carefully testing how much change can occur without disturbing the calm rhythm of the earth. You now enter a quieter form of movement in time, where change does not arrive as a sudden rupture, but as a slow redirection of water, soil, and human habit, unfolding so gently that entire generations may not fully realize they are witnessing transformation until they are already living within it, shaped by it without ever noticing the exact moment it began. The Yellow River continues its long geological behavior of shifting its course across the northern plains of ancient China. Over thousands of years, it repeatedly changes direction, sometimes dramatically, sometimes almost imperceptibly, reshaping floodplains and abandoning old channels that slowly turn into new fertile land. A modern observer might jokingly say this river had the worst GPS system in history, constantly recalculating without announcing it. Geological and sedimentary records show that these changes are not random, but driven by the enormous sediment load carried from upstream regions. As the river deposits layers of silt, it gradually raises its own bed, increasing the likelihood of flooding and eventual course diversion. It is almost as if the river is continuously rebuilding its own floor until it can no longer stay in the same room. For the communities living along its banks, these transformations are not abstract geological events, but lived experiences that unfold across lifetimes. Fields that were once reliable may become submerged, while distant lands may suddenly become fertile and accessible. One might humorously imagine farmers looking at the horizon and saying, "Well, I guess our land just moved again without telling us." Archaeological and paleoclimatic studies suggest that variations in rainfall patterns may have played a significant role in shaping these environmental shifts. Periods of increased precipitation could intensify flooding, while drier phases may reduce river stability and alter agricultural conditions. In this sense, climate acts like a slow, invisible hand, gently rearranging the map over centuries. You begin to see how deeply early agricultural societies depend on understanding these long-term environmental rhythms. Survival is not based on controlling nature, but on recognizing its tendencies and adjusting settlement patterns accordingly. A light, humorous thought might be that their weather forecasting system was simply look at where the river used to be and assume it might move again. As river paths shift, human communities gradually migrate in response, often following water sources, fertile soil, and safer terrain. These movements are typically not sudden mass displacements, but incremental relocations over generations. It feels like society is slowly sliding across the landscape rather than stepping abruptly from one place to another. This form of adaptation creates a dynamic relationship between humans and geography, where settlement locations are temporary agreements rather than fixed anchors. Villages may rise, decline, and reappear elsewhere, carrying cultural continuity even as physical space changes. One might lightly joke that ancient real estate agents probably had the most complicated job descriptions in history. Sediment analysis from ancient riverbeds reveals layers of human activity interwoven with natural deposition, showing how closely human life follows hydrological change. Tools, pottery fragments, and agricultural traces are often found embedded within shifting soil strata. It is as if the earth is quietly archiving human movement without ever being asked to do so. In this environment, adaptability becomes a core survival trait, embedded not only in behavior but also in cultural memory. Oral traditions likely carry knowledge of past floods, migrations, and fertile zones, passed gently from one generation to the next. A humorous observation might be that storytelling here functioned like a long-term navigation system, just without batteries or updates. The Yellow River's unpredictability does not stop settlement, but instead shapes how people live, encouraging flexible planning and careful attention to seasonal change. Communities learn to adapt without expecting permanence. It feels like living in a place where the furniture quietly rearranges itself every few decades, and everyone simply adjusts without surprise. Climate fluctuations in prehistoric and early historic times strongly affect agricultural productivity, increasing the need for mobility and resilience. Droughts and heavy rainfall change crop yields and determine where settlements can survive, creating repeated cycles of movement and resettlement. One might imagine early farmers quietly remarking that they should avoid becoming too emotionally attached to any single field. Despite environmental instability, cultural continuity remains remarkably resilient as tools, techniques, and traditions persist across shifting landscapes. Even when villages move, knowledge moves with them, maintaining a thread of identity across time. It feels like civilization is less rooted in place and more rooted in memory. The Yellow River itself becomes a central character in this slow environmental narrative, simultaneously destructive and generative. It erodes old land while creating new fertile plains, embodying a cycle of loss and renewal that repeats endlessly. A light humorous reflection might be that this river has mastered the art of both renovation and demolition without hiring separate contractors. Human responses to these changes are rarely dramatic, but instead consist of gradual adjustments in farming practices, settlement placement, and social organization. These adaptations accumulate over time, creating a flexible cultural system capable of surviving repeated environmental shifts. It is like evolution happening in real time, but with more patience and fewer headlines. Even architecture reflects this adaptability, with structures designed for relatively easy rebuilding or relocation when necessary. Materials such as wood, earth, and thatch allow for reconstruction without excessive complexity. One might humorously say that early builders had already embraced the philosophy of, if it floods, we'll just rebuild somewhere slightly less flooded. As you observe this shifting landscape, there is a growing sense that stability here is not defined by immobility, but by responsiveness. The land moves, the river moves, and people move, yet life continues in a continuous cycle of adjustment. Everything feels less like fixed history and more like a slow conversation between forces that never stop replying. And as this chapter gently settles into silence, you remain within a world where rivers redraw maps without warning, where climate quietly edits human settlement, and where survival is not about resisting change but about flowing with it, as if humanity itself is learning to move like water across an ever-changing earth. You now move into a quieter but more decisive turning of time, where human hands begin to interact with materials that do not exist in nature in their final form, and where the slow patience of stone begins to be joined by the controlled transformation of fire, metal, and intention, as if civilization is gently learning a new language spoken in heat and silence. At the end of the Neolithic period, in the central plains of ancient China, a significant technological transition begins to appear with the emergence of bronze casting techniques. Copper is combined with tin to create a stronger alloy, marking one of the earliest steps into what later becomes the Bronze Age. A modern observer might jokingly say this was humanity's first attempt at upgrading from stone addition to metal addition. Archaeological findings suggest that this technological shift does not occur suddenly, but gradually spreads across regions through experimentation and cultural exchange. Early metallurgical practices are closely tied to ritual and prestige rather than mass production. It feels like innovation here is not announced loudly, but introduced quietly, like a secret slowly shared among careful hands. The site known as Early II Culture, located in present-day Henan province, is often regarded by researchers as one of the earliest complex urban centers in China. Excavations reveal large palace foundations, workshops, and evidence of planned settlement organization, suggesting a level of social coordination beyond earlier village structures. One might humorously imagine it as the world's earliest city prototype version 0.1, still being debugged in real time. Within this emerging settlement system, bronze objects begin to appear in both functional and ceremonial contexts. These items include vessels, weapons, and ritual implements, each requiring specialized knowledge of casting and temperature control. The process itself is slow and demanding, involving furnace construction, mold preparation, and precise timing, almost like a very ancient form of high-stakes cooking with no recipe book. You can imagine the glow of furnaces at night, faintly illuminating workshops where artisans carefully manage fire and molten metal. The heat is intense, yet controlled, shaping materials into forms that were previously impossible with stone alone. A light, humorous thought might be that these early metal workers were essentially the first people to say, "Let's see what happens if we melt rocks on purpose." The emergence of bronze technology introduces new forms of social differentiation, as access to materials and specialized knowledge becomes increasingly important. Not everyone can participate in this process, which leads to the gradual development of skilled artisan groups. It is almost as if society begins to quietly assign new roles, like an early version of professional specialization without job titles or LinkedIn profiles. Erlitu's settlement patterns suggest organized spatial planning with distinct zones that may correspond to administrative, both residential, and craft-related functions. Large architectural foundations indicate structures that likely served elite or ceremonial purposes, reflecting increasing social complexity. A humorous observation might be that even in ancient times, some buildings were already VIP only, long before the invention of access badges. Despite these changes, agricultural life remains the foundation of daily existence, with millet cultivation continuing to support the population. Farming practices still follow seasonal cycles, maintaining continuity with earlier Neolithic traditions. It feels like technological advancement is happening on top of agriculture, rather than replacing it, like adding new layers to a long-running story. The introduction of bronze tools gradually influences efficiency in certain tasks, including farming, woodworking, and ceremonial production. However, their distribution is limited, suggesting that stone tools remain widely used alongside metal ones. One might jokingly compare this to a world where both smartphones and flip phones are still perfectly normal at the same time. Ritual practices appear to gain increasing importance during this period, with bronze vessels likely playing roles in offerings and ceremonies. These objects may symbolize authority, continuity, or connection to ancestral traditions. It is almost as if material objects begin to carry not only function but also meaning, quietly absorbing human belief into their surfaces. The production of bronze requires controlled knowledge of high-temperature furnaces, alloy ratios, and mold technologies, indicating a growing understanding of complex processes. This knowledge is likely transmitted through apprenticeship and repeated practice, rather than written instruction. A light, humorous thought might be that the training program probably involved a lot of "try again, but don't burn it this time." Erlitu's scale and organization suggest early forms of centralized coordination, though scholars continue to debate its exact political structure. Some interpret it as a proto-state formation, while others view it as a highly complex chiefdom. In either case, it represents a significant step in the long continuum of social development, rather than a sudden leap. The surrounding environment remains deeply connected to river systems, particularly the Yellow River Basin, which continues to shape settlement sustainability and agricultural productivity. Flooding and sedimentation still influence land use patterns, requiring ongoing adaptation. Even in this more complex society, nature remains the underlying framework within which everything operates. As bronze technology spreads, it does not erase earlier traditions, but blends with them, creating a layered cultural landscape where old and new coexist. Stone tools, wooden implements, and bronze objects all exist within the same temporal space. It feels like history is gently stacking different versions of itself rather than deleting previous ones. You begin to sense that technological change here is not experienced as rupture, but as gradual enrichment, where new capabilities slowly integrate into existing systems. Society expands in complexity without losing its agricultural grounding. A humorous reflection might be that progress here prefers to arrive unannounced and slowly unpack its luggage over several generations. Even the visual landscape of settlements subtly changes as workshops, storage areas, and larger buildings reshape the rhythm of space. Smoke from furnaces mixes with cooking fires, creating layered activity. It feels like the village quietly learns to glow in shifting shades over time. As this chapter settles into stillness, you remain in a world where bronze is still emerging rather than dominant, where metal begins to speak beside stone, and human society gently steps into new capability while still holding the slower rhythms of its ancient origins. You now enter a space where history and memory begin to blend more softly, where natural events are no longer only physical occurrences, but also stories shaped by generations of human reflection, as if the landscape itself has begun to speak through narrative rather than sediment alone. The Great Flood tradition of ancient China emerges as one of the most enduring collective memories associated with the early development of civilization along the Yellow River Basin. In these accounts, vast waters are said to have overflowed repeatedly, reshaping land and displacing communities across wide regions. A modern observer might jokingly say the river here had a long history of not respecting floor plans. Within this tradition appears the figure of Yu the Great, a cultural hero associated with the early control and management of floodwaters. According to ancient texts, Yu is remembered not for stopping the water, but for guiding it through channels and pathways, working with its natural tendencies rather than against them. It is almost as if early engineering philosophy here began with the idea that water should be negotiated with, not commanded. Archaeological interpretations and later historical writings suggest that large-scale flood control efforts may have played an important role in the formation of early political and administrative structures. Coordinating labor for canal digging, embankment construction, and water redirection would have required organized leadership. One might humorously imagine early communities debating infrastructure projects without spreadsheets, maps, or even a clear concept of budget approval. The Yellow River itself, with its heavy sediment load and unpredictable course changes, provides a natural context for repeated flooding events throughout prehistoric and early historic periods. These environmental conditions would have made water management a central concern for survival and agricultural stability. It feels like the river was simultaneously a provider and a very inconsistent roommate. In the traditional narrative, Yu is often portrayed as traveling across the land, observing terrain, and coordinating efforts to channel water through more stable pathways. Rather than staying in one place, the story emphasizes movement, observation, and adaptation. A light humorous thought might be that Yu essentially became the world's earliest field project manager, constantly walking between very wet construction sites. Some versions of the story describe years of continuous labor where communities work together to dig channels and redirect floodwaters away from settlements and farmland. Whether fully historical or mythological, these narratives reflect the importance of collective effort in responding to environmental challenges. It is almost like humanity's earliest long-term teamwork simulation, but with significantly more mud. The idea of controlling water rather than simply enduring it represents a conceptual shift in human-environment relationships. Instead of passive adaptation, there is now the beginning of intentional landscape modification. However, even this control remains limited and dependent on natural conditions. A humorous observation might be that nature still held the final decision-making authority, regardless of human plans. Flood myths across many cultures often symbolize both destruction and renewal, and the Chinese Great Flood tradition fits within this broader pattern of collective memory. In this context, water is not only a physical force, but also a metaphor for disruption and regeneration. It feels like the world is constantly being rewritten in wet ink that never fully dries. Later historical texts, such as those compiled during the early imperial period, elevate Yu's story into a foundational narrative of governance and order. This transformation of myth into political symbolism reflects how societies often reinterpret environmental history through cultural meaning. One might gently joke that history here comes with an editorial team that slowly upgrades stories into official versions. The association between flood control and legitimacy suggests that managing natural chaos was seen as closely linked to managing human society. Leaders who could organize large-scale environmental projects were likely viewed as capable of maintaining stability. It is almost as if governance itself began with the question, who can organize the biggest group of people to move the most dirt away from water? Archaeological evidence from early Bronze Age settlements indicates increasing investment in infrastructure, including drainage systems and settlement planning near river systems. While not directly linked to specific legendary figures, these developments reflect real responses to hydrological challenges. A light humorous thought might be that ancient engineers were probably very familiar with the phrase, "This was not in the original river plan." The narrative of Yu also emphasizes persistence and long-term commitment, as flood control efforts are described as spanning many years without interruption. This sense of sustained labor becomes part of the cultural memory associated with early state formation. It feels like time itself becomes a tool, not just a backdrop, in shaping human achievement. Water in this context is never truly an enemy or an ally, but a constant presence requiring attention, respect, and adaptation. The relationship between humans and rivers remains dynamic, with neither side achieving permanent dominance. A gentle, humorous reflection might be that the river and humans were essentially in a very long negotiation that neither side fully won. Over time, the story of Yu becomes deeply embedded in cultural identity, symbolizing cooperation, resilience, and the transformation of natural challenges into organized effort. Even as historical accuracy remains debated, its thematic importance persists across centuries. It is almost as if the story survives because it explains something emotional rather than strictly factual. You can imagine early communities gathering near rivers, sharing memories of past floods and successful diversions through oral storytelling. These narratives shaped understanding of environmental risk and response. Storytelling functioned as both history lesson and survival guide, without written pages or structured formats. The Great Flood tradition reflects a worldview where nature is vast, cyclical, and powerful, while humans remain small but capable of learning, adapting, and organizing. It is not about control, but alignment with larger forces. Humanity's earliest skill may have been politely redirecting water. As this chapter settles into quiet reflection, you remain in a world where floods become memory and metaphor, where Yu the Great symbolizes collective adaptation, and where rivers continue their endless movement, shaping both land and the stories people tell to understand it. You now arrive at a delicate threshold in time, where history no longer feels entirely like myth, yet still does not fully stand on the solid ground of verified record, as if the past itself is gently hesitating between being remembered and being interpreted. The Xia dynasty is described in ancient Chinese texts as one of the earliest ruling structures in the Central Plains, often positioned as a transitional era between legendary narratives and more clearly documented history. These accounts are primarily preserved in later historical writings, which attempt to reconstruct events that may have occurred many centuries earlier. A modern observer might jokingly say this is history's version of lost files recovered from an ancient hard drive. Archaeologists have often associated the Xia narrative with the Uruk culture, a Bronze Age civilization located in present-day Henan province. Excavations at Uruk reveal large architectural foundations, bronze workshops, and evidence of complex settlement organization, suggesting a level of social structure that aligns loosely with early state formation theories. It is almost as if archaeology and legend are quietly comparing notes without fully agreeing on the final version. However, the identification of Uruk as the physical manifestation of the Xia dynasty remains a subject of ongoing academic debate. Some scholars support the connection, while others argue that the evidence is insufficient to confirm a direct historical link. A light humorous thought might be that ancient history here is still waiting for its official confirmation email that never quite arrives. Despite this uncertainty, the idea of Xia persists strongly in cultural memory, representing an early vision of organized rulership and social hierarchy. Whether fully historical or partially symbolic, it serves as a conceptual bridge between mythological narratives and recorded dynastic history. It feels like a soft outline drawn on the edge of time, suggesting form without fully defining it. The Yellow River Basin continues to provide the environmental backdrop for these early complex societies, shaping settlement patterns, agricultural productivity, and regional interactions. The relationship between human communities and river dynamics remains central to survival and development. One might humorously imagine the river still acting like an uninvited editor, constantly revising human settlement drafts. Uruk settlements show signs of planned urban space, including large palatial structures that may have served administrative or ceremonial functions. These buildings suggest coordinated labor and resource allocation, indicating a degree of centralized organization. It is almost as if society is quietly experimenting with what it means to build a center in both physical and political terms. Bronze artifacts found at these sites include ritual vessels and tools, reflecting a growing importance of ceremonial practices alongside practical applications. These objects likely played roles in reinforcing social order and collective identity. A humorous reflection might be that bronze here was not just metal, but also a kind of status notification system in physical form. The transition from Neolithic village life to more complex settlement structures appears gradual rather than abrupt, with continuity in agricultural practices remaining strong. Millet cultivation continues to support population stability, anchoring these emerging societies in long-standing ecological rhythms. It feels like civilization is slowly changing its clothing while keeping the same heartbeat underneath. Oral traditions and later written records describe early rulers associated with the Shia period as figures responsible for organizing labor, managing floods, and maintaining social order. These narratives echo earlier flood control legends, suggesting continuity in cultural themes. One might lightly joke that leadership here always came with the job description: must be good at managing water and people simultaneously. The concept of lineage and hereditary leadership begins to appear more clearly in these narratives, suggesting evolving ideas of political continuity. Authority is increasingly imagined as something that can be passed down rather than temporarily assumed. It is almost like society is testing the idea of subscription-based leadership, renewed every generation. At the same time, material evidence remains open to interpretation, as no definitive written records from the Shia period have been conclusively identified. This absence of direct documentation keeps the period partially within the realm of interpretation rather than certainty. A gentle, humorous thought might be that Shia history is still waiting for its first properly labeled archive folder. The blending of archaeological findings and textual tradition creates a layered understanding of early Chinese civilization, where different forms of evidence overlap without fully merging. This overlap itself becomes meaningful, revealing how societies construct their own historical origins. It feels like multiple transparent layers of memory stacked on top of one another, each slightly offset from the others. Even without complete certainty, the Shia narrative plays an important role in shaping cultural continuity and historical imagination. It provides a conceptual starting point for later dynastic developments, linking mythic origins to more structured political systems. One might lightly say it is the prologue chapter that refuses to confirm whether it is fiction or nonfiction. Environmental factors continue to influence these early societies, with river dynamics, climate variability, and agricultural cycles shaping settlement stability. The need to manage water resources remains a recurring theme across generations. It is as if nature continues to co-author the story, occasionally rewriting entire paragraphs without warning. The idea of order becomes increasingly central during this transitional period, expressed through architecture, ritual, and emerging administrative practices. Even if specific political structures remain uncertain, the conceptual movement toward organized governance is clearly visible. A humorous reflection might be that humanity here is still trying to figure out the difference between leadership and who brought the best tools. As this chapter unfolds, Shia appears less as a fixed historical entity and more as a conceptual bridge, connecting earlier prehistoric societies with the more documented Bronze Age dynasties that follow. It exists in the space between certainty and possibility, where history is still being assembled from fragments of memory, landscape, and interpretation. And as the echoes of this early order gradually fade into stillness, you remain within a world where the boundary between myth and history is gently blurred, where civilizations begin to recognize themselves through stories as much as through artifacts, and where the past continues to breathe softly through the uncertain outlines of its own beginnings. You now enter a quieter and more formal atmosphere in the long unfolding of early Chinese civilization, where human activity begins to concentrate not only on survival or settlement, but on meaning itself, expressed through ritual actions that connect the visible world with something imagined beyond it, in silence, patience, and carefully controlled gesture. In the archaeological layers associated with pre-Shang or proto-Shang context, ritual practice becomes increasingly structured, with bronze vessels emerging as central objects in ceremonial activities. These artifacts are not merely tools, but carefully crafted items used in offerings, feasts, and symbolic communication with ancestral forces. A modern observer might jokingly say this is where humanity began taking formal dining etiquette to an entirely new spiritual level. Bronze casting techniques, already developing in earlier periods, now reach a level of refinement that allows for more standardized forms and repeated production of ritual vessels. These objects include tripods, wine containers, and ceremonial basins, each carrying specific symbolic associations. It feels like material culture is slowly learning to speak in a more disciplined and ceremonial vocabulary. The emergence of ritual systems reflects a broader transformation in social organization, where authority becomes increasingly linked to symbolic expression and controlled performance. Power is no longer only about resource management or labor coordination, but also about participation in shared ceremonial frameworks. One might lightly imagine early leaders thinking, if we make it look important enough, it will become important. In pre-Shang sites, evidence suggests that ritual spaces were carefully arranged, with designated areas for offerings and ceremonial gatherings. These spaces likely required coordination and shared understanding of timing, sequence, and roles. A humorous reflection might be that these were the earliest event planners, except every event had extremely high stakes and no printed invitations. The use of bronze in ritual context introduces a sensory dimension where sound, weight, and visual presence contribute to the experience of ceremony. When bronze vessels are moved or placed, they produce subtle resonant tones that contrast with the surrounding silence. It is almost as if the material itself participates in the ritual by quietly announcing its presence. This period also shows signs of increasing social stratification, as access to bronze objects and ritual participation may have been limited to certain groups or individuals. Such differentiation suggests that symbolic systems are beginning to reinforce social structure. One might humorously say that bronze here functioned as both a spiritual medium and an early form of exclusive membership badge. The Yellow River Basin continues to serve as the environmental foundation for these developments, providing agricultural stability that supports population growth and specialization. Even as ritual complexity increases, daily life remains anchored in farming cycles and seasonal rhythms. It feels like two layers of existence are unfolding simultaneously, one grounded in soil, the other in symbolism. Ritual practices likely involved offerings of food, wine, and crafted objects, arranged according to established sequences that may have been passed down through generations. These actions create a sense of continuity and order that extends beyond individual lifetimes. A light, humorous thought might be that ancient ceremonies were basically very formal conversations with ancestors who never replied directly, but were always considered present. The soundscape of these rituals is likely minimal but intentional, with controlled movements, occasional bronze contact sounds, and moments of stillness dominating the atmosphere. Silence itself becomes an active component of the ceremony, framing each gesture with emphasis. It is as if quietness has become a structured part of communication. Archaeological findings suggest that ritual bronzes were often buried in pits or tombs, indicating their role in funerary practices and beliefs about continuity after death. These objects accompany individuals or lineages into burial contexts, symbolizing ongoing relationships between the living and the deceased. One might gently joke that even in the afterlife, people here still needed proper tableware. The development of ritual systems reflects a growing conceptual separation between everyday life and sacred or ceremonial space. This distinction allows societies to organize meaning into structured categories, reinforcing shared cultural understanding. It feels like human experience is slowly being divided into ordinary time and ceremonial time, each with its own rhythm. Although written records from this exact transitional period are limited, later Shang inscriptions provide insight into the continuation and expansion of ritual bronze culture. This continuity suggests that earlier practices evolved rather than disappeared. A humorous observation might be that tradition here behaves like a very persistent habit that refuses to uninstall itself. The craftsmanship of bronze vessels also indicates the presence of specialized artisans who likely worked within organized production systems. These individuals possess technical knowledge of casting, mold making, and alloy control. It is almost like early society quietly introduced the concept of skilled professions without formally announcing job descriptions. As ritual complexity increases, the relationship between human authority and symbolic systems becomes more tightly interwoven. Leadership is expressed not only through action, but through participation in carefully structured ceremonies. One might lightly imagine that legitimacy here depended partly on how gracefully someone could handle extremely heavy ceremonial objects without dropping them. The physical environments of these ritual sites are likely designed to emphasize order, symmetry, and controlled movement. Even without modern architecture, spatial arrangements reflect intentional organization of human interaction with objects in space. It feels like space itself is being trained to behave respectfully during important moments. Over time, these ritual practices contribute to a shared cultural framework that reinforces continuity across generations, even as political structures evolve. The repetition of ceremonies creates a sense of stability in a world that is otherwise shaped by environmental change and social transformation. A gentle humorous thought might be that ritual here functions like a save point in the long game of civilization. And as this chapter settles into quiet stillness, you remain within a world where bronze is no longer just material innovation, but a medium of silence and meaning, where ritual becomes a language without words, and where human society begins to organize not only what it does, but how it remembers itself through carefully shaped objects, movements, and enduring, reverent quiet. You now enter a world where silence becomes language, and where the act of asking questions is no longer only spoken into the air, but carefully carved into bone, preserved through fire, and read back as if time itself had agreed to answer in fragments of smoke, crack, and careful interpretation. In the Shang dynasty, one of the earliest clearly documented dynasties in Chinese history, a sophisticated system of divination emerges through the use of oracle bones. These bones, typically ox scapulae and turtle plastrons, are inscribed with early Chinese characters and subjected to heat until they crack, forming patterns interpreted as responses from the unseen world. A modern observer might jokingly say this was the world's first customer support system, except the replies were slightly harder to interpret and came with no guarantee of clarity. The archaeological site of Yinshu, located near modern Anyang in Henan province, reveals the remains of a highly organized urban and ceremonial center. Excavations have uncovered palatial foundations, royal tombs, workshops, and vast quantities of oracle bones, indicating a complex society structured around both governance and ritual communication. It feels like an entire city built around the idea of carefully listening to silence. Oracle bone inscriptions represent one of the earliest known forms of Chinese writing, capturing questions about weather, harvests, warfare, and royal health. These inscriptions show a society deeply invested in understanding patterns of nature and fate through systematic observation and ritual inquiry. One might lightly imagine ancient scribes thinking, let's ask the bone again, just to be absolutely sure the rain is still confused about tomorrow. The process of divination involves preparation of the bone, carving of inscriptions, application of heat, and interpretation of resulting cracks. Each stage requires precision and controlled handling, suggesting that this was both a spiritual and administrative practice. It is almost like combining scientific experimentation with ceremonial procedure, but with significantly higher emotional stakes. Yinshu's urban structure reflects a carefully organized settlement with distinct zones for royal activity, ritual performance, and craft production. The scale of the site suggests centralized authority capable of mobilizing large labor forces and maintaining administrative continuity. A humorous reflection might be that even ancient city planning here already included very strict "you are here" zones, just without printed maps. The Shang royal court appears to have relied heavily on divination for decision-making, integrating oracle bone readings into governance processes. Questions recorded on bones include matters of agriculture, military campaigns, and ancestral guidance. It feels like leadership here operated with a constant consultation process, except the committee meetings were held with burning heat and cracked bone surfaces. The writing system found on oracle bones demonstrates remarkable continuity with later Chinese characters, indicating a long developmental trajectory of written language. These inscriptions are concise, structured, and highly functional, reflecting a focus on clarity of communication rather than decorative expression. A light humorous thought might be that early writing here skipped draft mode and went straight to final version only. Environmental context remains central to Shang concerns, particularly the prediction of rainfall and agricultural success. The dependence on seasonal cycles and river behavior continues to shape administrative priorities. It is as if nature still holds a permanent seat in every decision-making meeting, silently influencing outcomes without ever speaking directly. The presence of large bronze workshops at Yinshu further emphasizes the integration of ritual, production, and political authority. Bronze vessels used in ceremonies reinforce social hierarchy and ancestral veneration, linking material culture with ideological structure. One might jokingly say bronze here was basically the ancient equivalent of both ceremonial dress code and official branding system. Royal tombs discovered at Yinshu contain elaborate burial goods, including bronze vessels, jade objects, and sometimes human and animal sacrifices. These findings indicate complex beliefs regarding the afterlife and the continuation of social identity beyond death. It feels like society here was carefully preparing people for a very long journey with very detailed luggage arrangements. The combination of writing, ritual, and governance suggests that knowledge during the Shang period is highly centralized and formalized. Information is recorded, interpreted, and acted upon within structured systems that reinforce authority. A humorous observation might be that data management here involved literally carving questions into bone and waiting for nature to respond with abstract punctuation. Oracle bone inscriptions also reveal the repetitive nature of concerns, with similar questions asked multiple times in slightly different forms, indicating uncertainty and caution in decision-making. This repetition reflects a desire for consistency in interpreting unpredictable natural conditions. It is almost like ancient civilization was stuck in an endless loop of, "Are we sure it will rain this time?" The city of Yinshu itself appears to have functioned as both political capital and ritual center, where administrative and spiritual activities are deeply intertwined. The boundaries between governance and ceremony are not clearly separated, but instead exist as overlapping systems. One might lightly imagine that every important decision came with a ceremonial checklist attached. Archaeological evidence suggests that scribes and ritual specialists held important roles in Shang society, responsible for recording inscriptions and interpreting divination results. These individuals likely possess specialized training in both writing and ritual procedures. It feels like an early form of professional expertise where literacy itself becomes a source of authority. Despite Shang society's formal structure, daily life remains tied to agriculture, crafts, and seasonal cycles. State complexity does not remove dependence on the land, but organizes it. Even advanced civilizations still quietly worry whether the millet will grow successfully each year. The oracle bone system represents a unique intersection of language, ritual, and governance, where written symbols become tools for negotiating uncertainty. Each inscription captures a moment of human hesitation transformed into physical form. It is as if doubt itself has been carefully preserved in stone-like memory. As this chapter settles into stillness, you remain within a world where silence is no longer empty but encoded, where questions are literally written into bone, and where the act of understanding reality becomes a slow, deliberate dialogue between human intention and the unpredictable patterns of nature, time, and belief. You now arrive at the final layer of time, where human history is no longer experienced as a sequence of events, but as a thin, almost delicate film resting on top of a vast geological memory that has been forming, dissolving, and reforming long before any civilization ever learned to name itself. Across millions of years of sedimentation, the landscapes of ancient China are not static backdrops, but living archives shaped by pressure, erosion, and the slow movement of tectonic forces. Every river course, every valley, every plain is the result of countless cycles of accumulation and removal, as if the planet itself is constantly rewriting its own surface without ever needing an editor. In this vast timeline, all dynasties, whether mythic, transitional, or historically documented, become extremely thin layers within a much larger geological structure. The Xia, Shang, and all earlier cultural horizons appear like brief annotations written on the edge of a much older stone manuscript. A modern observer might gently joke that humanity's entire recorded history would barely register as a footnote in Earth's long-form edition. The Yellow River continues its ancient pattern of movement, carrying sediment from distant highlands and depositing it across lowlands in slow, repetitive cycles. Over geological time, this process builds and erodes entire regions, continuously reshaping the conditions under which human life eventually emerges. It feels as if the river is not just flowing through land, but also through time itself. Ice ages come and go, not as dramatic interruptions in a human narrative, but as long climatic rhythms that reshape ecosystems across vast regions. Glacial advances and retreats alter sea levels, vegetation zones, and migration patterns of both animals and early humans. One might lightly imagine the planet quietly adjusting its temperature settings over tens of thousands of years without ever notifying its inhabitants. Tectonic activity continues beneath the surface, slowly uplifting mountains and opening basins that will one day become fertile agricultural regions. These processes operate on timescales far beyond human perception, yet they determine the fundamental shape of every landscape in which civilizations later appear. It is almost like the Earth is continuously building the stage long before any actors arrive. Within this immense geological framework, human civilizations emerge briefly, like ripples on a surface that has already existed for unimaginable durations. Each culture, each dynasty, each technological advancement appears and disappears, leaving behind only traces embedded within soil layers and archaeological deposits. A humorous reflection might be that history here behaves like a very enthusiastic guest who arrives, rearranges the furniture, and leaves before anyone fully notices. Sediment cores taken from river basins reveal alternating layers of flood deposits, agricultural soils, and natural sediments, each representing different phases of environmental and human interaction. These layers form a vertical timeline that records both natural events and human activity in a single continuous structure. It feels like the planet is keeping a diary, but instead of writing sentences, it writes in layers of dust and stone. Fossil pollen, mineral composition, and microfossil evidence embedded within these sediments provide clues about ancient climates and ecological shifts. These scientific records extend far beyond written history, offering a perspective on time that dwarfs human civilization. One might gently joke that if Earth had a resume, humanity would appear only in the most recent paragraph on the final page. Glacial cycles repeatedly reshape the availability of water, soil fertility, and habitable zones, indirectly influencing where early human societies can develop. These slow oscillations create opportunities and constraints that guide migration and settlement patterns over thousands of years. It is as if nature is gently rearranging living conditions while humans are still learning the rules of the game. Even the formation of river systems, like the Yellow River, is part of a much larger geological choreography, where erosion, sediment transport, and uplift interact continuously. The river is never truly the same from one epoch to another, even if its name remains unchanged in human memory. A light humorous thought might be that rivers are the ultimate long-term planners, constantly redesigning their routes without ever announcing a new version number. When viewed at this scale, human achievements like writing systems, bronze metallurgy, and early states become brief bursts within a slow planetary system. They matter deeply to humans but are fleeting in geological time. Civilization feels like a small flicker in an ancient darkened room. Within this fleeting moment, humans create language, memory, ritual, and history to preserve meaning against time's constant movement. Writing becomes a tool against forgetting as the world slowly changes. One might joke that it is humanity leaving sticky notes on a constantly redecorating planet. Over time, even the most durable human constructions are eventually absorbed back into soil, buried under new layers of sediment, or eroded by water and wind. What remains are fragments, interpreted later by those who attempt to reconstruct lost worlds. It is almost like history is always partially hidden, requiring careful excavation to be heard again. The concept of permanence begins to dissolve when viewed against geological time, replaced instead by cycles of formation and disappearance. Nothing remains fixed, yet nothing disappears completely. Everything is transformed into another state of matter or memory. A gentle, humorous reflection might be that even mountains are just very patient waves pretending to be solid. In this final perspective, human history is not an isolated story, but part of a much larger Earth system that includes climate, geology, biology, and time itself. Civilizations rise and fall within this system, shaped by forces far beyond individual control or awareness. It feels like humanity is not outside the story of Earth, but quietly written into its margins. And as all these layers settle into stillness, you are left with a sense of profound continuity, where the distinction between past and present becomes less important than the ongoing transformation of matter and time, where everything that has ever existed continues to exist in another form, quietly folded into the slow, eternal silence of the planet itself. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.